afternoon and good evening to you, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Dr. Jifa Dordonu, and I am the co-director of education and research with the Pan-Canadian Association of Nurses of African Descent. I am delighted that you are joining us today. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional and ceded territory of the Lekwungen people here on the Coast Salish Sea. I invite all of you to reflect on the land that you are situated today and aim to bring the better versions of yourself for the work around reconciliation and for healing. As you know, just a few housekeeping items. This is a webinar and everybody has access to the chat. If you have questions or opinions that you want to express, by all means, we invite you to put them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on those and respond to them verbally or in the chat as indicated. We will we have zero tolerance for nonsense or any disrespect. So if anybody is being shows to be exhibiting any of those behaviors, you will be removed from the webinar. Before we get to our two panelist discussion, I'm just going to turn it over to our president of our association, Damiola, to introduce you to the association and our goals and visions.
Thank you, Dr. Dordonu, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Damiola Iduye, and I am happy to be here today, and I'm happy to welcome you all to our webinar. As Dr. Dordonu shared, the name of our organization is the Pan-Canadian Association of Nurses of African Descent. And I know that some of you, this may be your first time hearing about the organization. So I just want to provide a quick overview of who we are and how you can connect with us. So this first photo that you see on your screen was the meeting that we had with Canada's Chief Nursing Officer last year, Dr. Lee Chapman. And as you can see, we are nurses from across Canada. In this photo, we have nurses from Nova Scotia, nurses from Ontario, nurses from BC. We have Saskatchewan folks represented as well. So you could say this is the face of PCANAD, and you would know more about us in a bit. So why did we come together to form this organization? One thing that we know, and I'm sure that it's not new to most people in this room, is that anti-Black racism is a public health crisis, not only in Canada, but all over the world. Even in countries like African countries with predominantly Black people, we see, foreigners treating Black people differently in their homeland. And this first statement was from the Canadian Nurses Association. So in 2020, they put together a statement, a declaration on anti-racism. And at that time, we were fortunate as an organization to be part of that voice, because we also provided feedback on that. And one thing that, is common across all provinces and territories is that the experience of Black nurses in our so beloved country mirror systemic and institutional racism and injustices. So you will hear many people say, oh, slavery was a long time ago, but the remnant of slavery is still alive and is still breathing in our midst. And it's quite unfortunate that nurses who are the, I would say, we know like the most highly rated health profession, and this has been proven many times, we face racism. So it's a caring profession. We provide care to our patients, to our clients, to communities, but quite unfortunate that us who identify as people of African descent, we continue to face racism in our places of work. So we came together to form this, I would say, collective. And the second statement on this screen was from the open letter by the coalition. So that's the Coalition of African Caribbean Black Nurses in British Columbia. You will know more a little bit about them in a minute. In what they did in 2020, and I'm sure everybody knew what happened in 2020. Yes, we were just in the pandemic, and then the horrific murder of George Floyd happened, and it seemed as if everybody realized that Black people were treated unfairly all over the world. So different organizations came together to provide support to Black nurses, to Black people generally. And one of those organizations is the Coalition. And they put together an open letter to different stakeholder organizations and partners in BC. They also collected some data from their members. And one of the things, the statement in that open letter is what I have on this slide, and I'll read it out loud. Together, we have the opportunity to once and for all create a culture of safety for everyone within the health system. And we are strategically positioned at this moment in history to make significant advancement in this area. This is a call not only for Black people, but for every organization. And for anything to be implemented, any strategy, any anti-Black racism strategy to be implemented, it has to be with us, by us, and not, and for us. So this is just, the highlight of, why we all came together. And in the next slide, I'll just share with you a little bit about our history. So some people are just getting to know the organization, but the conversation around forming this collective started many years ago, even before 2020. So in 2017, one of our nurse pioneers, Dr. Josephine Etowa, had a conversation with the National Black Nurses Association in the United States. At that time, they were thinking of having a Canadian branch of that organization. And if you don't know about NBNA, they've been in existence for over 50 years. But forming an organization, it's not an easy task. At that time, there wasn't just enough, I would say, resources to move forward. But 2 years after, in Nova Scotia, a group of us, we were thinking about having a Black nurses organization, not only in Nova Scotia, but across the country. But one thing that we felt was important was that we had to connect with nurses from across Canada to have a national organization. We cannot put together a national organization without having the voices of everybody, or maybe most people represented. So that 2019, we decided to call our own organization Association of Black Nurses of Nova Scotia chapter. Instead of naming it a full organization, we realized that it has to be a chapter of something. So in actualizing that goal of having a national platform, some leaders from Nova Scotia reached out to the Canadian Nurses Association in 2020. It was like early fall of 2020, just to ask questions about, what other jurisdictions are doing and if CNA had interest from other nurses from across the country. And not surprisingly, at that time, other nurses had connected with CNA as well. So CNA brought all of us together, and that was the beginning of this beautiful organization. We started having that conversation around how can we collectively work together. So from fall 2020 to fall 2021, we had series of meetings. We had series of provincial engagements, calling people that we know, word of mouth, reaching out to different organizations, doing different things, and just having that intentional conversation about what a collaborative could look like. So in fall of 2020, we officially, started, I would say that, although it's been in existence for a long time, but for 2020, we had a name, and April 2022, we incorporated as a not-for-profit organization. So when we came together, we had one key guiding principle, because we realized that different provinces have their own organizations, and we don't want an organization that would duplicate what other provinces are doing. So one guiding principle that shapes everything we do is that we do not take away from the incredible work or prevent the furtherance of other provincial organizations or jurisdictional organizations. So collectively, we are working together to serve the interest of nurses of African descent. And I have to say that we realize that there is no uniform name, for us as people of African descent. Some people go by Black, some people go by of Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean. So we acknowledge that, but in a way to be inclusive, we decided to go with nurses of African descent. Of course, we are inclusive of every other individuals who identify differently. So these are our members. We have nurses from Alberta, we have nurses from British Columbia, and they have an organization. That's a coalition that I mentioned. Then we also have the Canadian Black Nurses Network. So this organization was founded by Dion Sinclair from Ontario. And this is an example of an organization that has no provincial affiliation because it's federal in mandate. So Dion's work focuses on strengthening Black nurses leadership. And she's a vice president at CAMH. So our area of expertise is bringing everybody to top executive positions, and she's been doing that well. And I'll go back to the coalition in BC. Recently, they started a mentorship, a 6-week mentorship program that was funded. They have nursing students in that program. They have practicing nurses, and they have nurse leaders from across the country mentoring other people. They've done a lot of incredible work in that province, and we are so proud of them. I read a master's thesis from a student from BC recently who really focused on how the organization was formed and the things that they're doing in that province. We also have nurses from Manitoba. This time, Manitoba doesn't have a provincial organization for Black nurses or nurses of African descent, but we have individuals from that province. And I am from Nova Scotia, so I represent the Black Nurses Association of Nova Scotia. Then we also have Ontario Black Nurses Network. So this is the provincial organization for Black nurses in Ontario, and that was founded by Shelley Philip Laforey, who also happens to be our vice president. Recently, the Saskatchewan folks, they too have been having meetings for so long, and just recently they decided on the name and they've officially formed their organization. So it's called the Saskatchewan Association of African Caribbean Black Nurses. They are working on the details of the organization. They are live on Twitter, so you can follow them. And we also have nurses from other provinces not listed here who had signified interest in joining us. So we'll update these slides in the near future. And at this time, I want to just give out an open call that for any organization we serve in the interest of nurses of African descent or Black nurses, Jamaican nurses, irrespective of the name that they use, they are welcome to be part of this collective. We're not stopping what any different organizations are doing. We are all working together to have a platform to share resources and also to support each other. So our mission statement, that's what I have on this slide. We have 2 main missions, and then our vision is to have inspired, engaged, and empowered nurses of African descent to become leaders in their field and lead change for equitable healthcare in Canada. Our first mission is to amplify the voices of nurses of African descent, and that makes sense because that's what we represent, by promoting recruitment, retention, and we don't want to stop with recruitment and retention. Representation, it's good, but it's not the ultimate outcome that we should be striving towards. We also want professional advancement of nurses of African descent so that we can be in leadership positions in any domain of practice, in education, in practice, in administration, in research and policy. Then our second mission is to advance the health and well-being of people of African descent. And you would see that since November last year, we've been, working on this, presenting this Caring for Black Bodies webinars, and that aligns with our second mission. At the beginning of our fiscal year, like towards the end of last year, we had a conversation about what our goal should be for the year. And we know in 2020, 2021, like people are now aware of how anti-Black racism affects everyone in Canada and also in nursing. But we thought we wanted to be solution-oriented this year. And one gap that we identified as nurses was that in our different curricula across Canada, anything that deals with Black health is either it's not talked about or they only have maybe a few classes on it. So one of the priorities that we identified was to, talk about different disease conditions that affect Black people, people of African descent differently, and then increase awareness. So that is the idea about this webinar, and Dr. Doduno will share more insight about that after I'm done. So yes, we welcome you again. Thank you for joining. And this is our leadership team. Yes, I'm serving as the president representing Nova Scotia. Can see our vice president from Ontario. We have our co-directors of communication from Nova Scotia and Alberta. We have our director of finance from BC. We have our co-directors of research and education from Ontario, from Nova Scotia and BC. Then we have our co-directors of student engagement from Alberta and Ontario, and then we have regional boards of directors. So you can see that we are representative, although we are still trying to connect with folks in the territories, but we do hope that people will join our collective. So just to recap, these are key areas of change: education, and this is one of our strategies. Research is part of it. We have some of us who are working on different research and we get to collaborate together, which is nice. Community engagement, we'll be meeting with different organizations, mentorship, peer support, advocacy and practice support. And all of this, we've started working on this area, but in the next few years, we know that we'll have more resources to share with the general public on our progress. And lastly, I'm sure you're probably wondering, what's next after this? So I am happy, excited, thrilled. I can't think of all the words that I can use to share that we'll be hosting the inaugural Canadian Black Nurses Conference in Nova Scotia. And that's going to be from November 9 to 11. So this is still early. We're in the early stage of planning this. When working together, we recognize that this is something that has to happen. And we want it to be an avenue to just gather together, to connect, to support each other, and also to showcase our excellence. So if you are a member of any organization that is not represented with PCANAD, please, you're welcome to join us and we can all work together on making this a success. And this is what we are doing today, this webinar. And I'm really thrilled to have Saya and Dr. Mishuri Dryden to talk us through this. So if you want to learn more about the organization, you're welcome to join our movement. That's our email. You can follow us on Twitter. On Instagram, we recently opened this. We're also on Facebook, and of course, check out our website, which is a work in progress. So we have most of the things on our website, but we'll be adding more information. Thank you so much. And I will hand over back to you, Dr. Doduno.
Thank you so much, Damiola. That was a great overview. And so just to get us, situate us and sort of recap in terms of where we've been and why we're here. So as Damiola has indicated, and before I actually get there, for all of you who are asking questions, please continue to do so. You can use either the chat or the Q&A function. Your chats and everything comes directly to the panelists, so we will see it. And we'll be addressing that as time goes on. So the question is, how did we get here? Why are we here? Why are we tackling this? And why is our webinar entitled Caring for Black Bodies? The question that I want to ask you that we have also been pondering is, what's in a skin color? What is in a skin color? Because if you would read all the literature out there, society believe that they can predict everything about our being, about my being as a woman in a Black body by just looking at my skin color. And the truth is, what is skin color? Is skin color race? Is skin color ancestry? Or is skin color ethnicity? And the answer is that it's not clearly defined, and it has not been clearly defined for so long. And because of that, a lot of the information about those of us in Black bodies have been conflated. And so one of the goals of this webinar was to try to demystify some of those long-held beliefs about our bodies. One thing we want to make clear, our race is not the same as your the same as ancestry. So there's been a lot of research and literature been done where, you know, we have oh, I just lost my thought. We have studied the DNA of people, population across the world, and basically decided, know that our genes and our DNA is essentially the same. Meaning that there's only one human race, there's not multiple human races, right? So, you know, back in the 1600s and the 1800s, there was that belief that the way the physical attributes of people, right? My skin color, my eye, all of these things actually spoke to a biological predispositioning of me. And so that information is erroneous, has been debunked way back in, for a very long time, but you will continue to see literature, and even in our regular day-to-day engagement where people tend to conflate race and ancestry. The evidence is also very clear that race is a socially constructed concept that has been used to disadvantage and advantage people within the society. We know that going back into the slave era here in North America, where in order for you to deny me service, you use my physical presentation to do that. So the evidence is quite clear, and we as an association wanted to ensure that our societies, our nurses and beyond knows the difference between race, ancestry, and also knowing that race is a socially constructed variable. So then what do we do then when we start talking about ancestry? Well, or if you want to talk about biology, the evidence again shows that if you want to talk about biology of people, the best indicator of that would be ancestry, because ancestry represents this sort of geographic area that people come from. Again, the cautionary tale there is that because of migration movement and, you know, mixing of people, you can't, in all honesty, look at somebody and determine their ancestry. But if you wanted to talk about biology, your ancestry, and then therefore genetic analyses would be the way that researchers can go about uncovering what sort of biological mechanisms that might underpin disease processes. But despite this, there's been warnings and publications over and over again, because we continue to see race being misrepresented in the literature, particularly as far as those of us in Black bodies are concerned. So even myself a few years ago said, you know what, we need to really understand that it's not the race of people that is driving biological predispositioning for the conditions. It is actually racism. Oftentimes when we talk about race, what we're really trying to talk about is racism and not the biology of people. So making sure that we are consistent in our language and making sure that we are consistent in terms of the recommendations that are coming from that is important. Recently, there was just I think 2 weeks ago, there was a publication that came out essentially reiterating these principles again. And for those of you who have not seen it, I urge you to, you can Google it up and look it up. There were several recommendations in there, and it talks about even something like using the word Caucasian. That should not be showing up in any of our literature anymore in 2023. The literature has debunked some of these things, and we continue to use it only to reinforce the stereotypes and in some way worsen the health disparities that populations experience. So I'll put in the link in a little later, but if you haven't seen it, I urge you to Google it right now, pull the full report, and also, particularly if you are in research or even education, pull the recommendation and see how ways in which we can actually start entangling these conflation that often happen between race and biology. So what are some examples of how race is misrepresented in our health system? A lot of people are aware of this. Glomerular filtration rate is a common indicator that we use in clinical practice to determine the kidney function of people. This calculation has race correction in it, and that race correction basically says that Black people or people in the Black body have higher muscle mass, and because they have higher muscle mass, they need to have this correction to adjust for the higher creatinine level. The truth is, that's a lie. It's a lie, and that correction doesn't need to be there. And in fact, that correction has made it so much so that if an individual who is Black in a Black body has kidney problems, even if they're sick, according to these calculation and this correction, they will never be sick enough to get the tertiary and some of the aggressive treatments that they need. Do you think that might be contributing to the sort of the disproportional representation of individuals in Black bodies around kidney disease? Absolutely. I will also say that the United States of America, say what you want about them. Recently, I know that their president has actually commissioned a group to be looking at this. And the last publication I saw around this, that I think it was like about 2/3 of the laboratories in the United States were either have removed this correction from their algorithm, or they're in the process of doing so. Whether this is happening in Canada right now, I have no idea, but I will tell you that when this conversation came up, I know clinical people that said this does not happen in Canada, and I want to prove for that. I am 100% sure that it's happening in Canada. We just not seeing it, or it's not clear for us to see. The art of medicine. So this paper has been a while ago, but the way in which this race thing also appears is that back in the early 2000s, the FDA actually approved a drug, Bidil, for the treatment of Black people, heart failure in Black people. Again, if Blackness is a socially constructed variable, how is it that this drug is going to improve somebody's health status? Now, that drug is no longer approved, but this again is an example of how race is misconstructed to be a biological variable in the health system. This other paper talks about, does Black ethnicity influence stent thrombosis? Again, thrombosis is a very biologically driven process. How is it that a Black ethnicity can influence that factor? And if you read that paper in detail, the way in which they determine Black ethnicity is self-reported. It's self-reported. And I will say that, again, the part of the conflation that happened is people look at somebody like me, and they think they can determine my ethnicity from my color. And for those of us from the continent of Africa, that is false. You can't. We might be Black in race, we might be African in our ancestry, but I guarantee you, you will not know our ethnicity unless we tell you, or unless you have enough information to look at our names and maybe make some educated guess based on that. And so these things continue to be published. The Canadian Diabetes Association, I know they've changed this, but back in 2018, the risk factors that were listed for being for the development of type 2 were all around this sort of ethnic background, they say, being African, being Arab, Asian, Hispanic, and so on and so forth. We know that diabetes type 2 is very much a socially driven disease, right? It's about the environment that you're living in. That, at least type 2 is what I'm talking about. That drives the occurrence of this illness. But you still see, I know they've corrected it all now, but I will say you still see a lot of that in other parts of, in other publication. The other one for you to also pay attention to is right now, like this came up in COVID-19, but I'm an ICU nurse, and in the early 2000s, we knew this was happening. And I would, I'm not a betting woman, but I will say that if you talk to any old school ICU nurses out there, they know that this happened, right? So what we knew or what we saw was that the pulse oximetry didn't actually correlate to the oxygen saturation in somebody's blood. So in our practice, it was a common occurrence for us to correlate the pulse oximetry with arterial blood gas on admission to make sure that we don't inadvertently mistreat or misdiagnose hypoxemia in somebody. But in COVID-19, it became a big issue because of, patients were presenting sicker than they were, hypoxic, and weren't getting the necessary care. But again, this has been around or the knowledge of this has been around for so long, but it has not been acted upon. The question I ask you is how many lives do you think have been lost because we weren't able to adequately detect hypoxemia in somebody's blood? Again, I know that in the United States, the commission has actually asked the manufacturers of these devices to address this issue. Not sure what Trudeau and all the other governments here in Canada are doing, but hopefully whatever changes and corrections made to the pulse oximetry, we here will also benefit. So then that brought us to what you are seeing here about the caring for Black bodies. And so we wanted to start off by talking about one of those diseases within our population that is often not misdiagnosed, but the conflation between race and biology, or social and biology, is very evident, and that is sickle cell anemia. So we started our webinar series with sickle cell anemia, where we learned that it's not a Black disease. Sickle cell disease does not discriminate. It does have a high occurrence in certain population, but sickle cell disease can happen in people of Asian descent, people of Middle Eastern descent, and so it's not a Black disease. It's a genetic disorder in which if you have parents with that gene, you have a higher chances of having it. In that webinar, we also learned that there are barriers and gaps in the care of people with sickle cell disease right here in Canada. One of the things around prevention, for example, if you are a person of African descent in Canada trying to get blood testing, so you want to get a hemoglobinophoresis to try and look at the types of hemoglobins that you have in your body, it's difficult to get that test. Because the health system just doesn't know about it. And the other part of that is sometimes when you are tested and you're found to have a trait, sometimes that information is not even disclosed to you. So how is it that you can make an informed decision about your reproductive rates or your reproductive health when that information will not be disclosed to you? The other issue we learned was around the lack of newborn, or sort of a pan-Canada newborn screening, which is a big issue, right? Because, and then the added part of that is that a lot of folks who are migrating into Canada are not born in Canada, right? So we still need access to be screened in order for individuals to make an informed decisions. And then the other part of that too is that there is no national registry to even see how many people in Canada have sickle cell disease. It's an estimate, right? Oftentimes estimate based on Toronto experience or maybe Eastern Canada experience, but not so much here on the Western and in between. So national registry is something that the Sickle Cell Association of Canada had been pushing for. And why does all of these things matter? It all matter because ultimately, if you're trying to advocate for treatments and treatment options for people here in Canada, you need that data, and that data does not exist. So we need that data. For those of you who are interested, please get in touch with the Sickle Cell Association of Canada, and they will be more than happy to provide you with the list of things that are needed and the gaps that are current in the care of a patient with sickle cell disease. In that conversation, one thing that became clear was the need for blood. Right now, the treatment for sickle cell is really down to two things. We're talking about hydroxyurea, and then and blood transfusion. And so two therapies, and it's 2023 when we're trying to colonize Mars and other places, and we can't find a more effective treatment for sickle cell disease. Come on, why is that? So that barrier around blood led us to the next topic, or at least before we get to that one, we did a second webinar on sickle cell because the enormity of the information was just too much to go cover in one setting. So in the second webinar, we talked about the nursing care of the patient with sickle cell anemia. As Daniela had actually alluded to, a lot of the health conditions that biologically happens to occur at a higher rate in people of African descent are not even touched upon in nursing curricula. People will say, oh, it's because there's not a lot of Black people in Canada and all of this stuff. That's not a truth, right? So that is not covered in the nursing curricula. And so how are nurses supposed to recognize a patient in sickle cell crisis and not let that person sit in the hospital in the ED for hours? And vaso-occlusive crisis is an emergency. It's a medical emergency. And if you're not taught in the nursing program, how are you to recognize that? So we talked about the nursing care of sickle cell anemia. All of the videos will be available to you for you to take a look at if you had missed any of them. One of the other thing that came out of this, and I had just talked about, was donation. So sickle cell disease now can be curable for some people, for a small number of people. So we had the next webinar series around stem cell donation, in which we had a very riveting discussion around what does that look like and why is there a disparity again in this. And then there was a call for donors for stem cell. And so again, this video will be available to you should you wish to watch it later. And ultimately, all of that fed right back to where we are today. You will hear that there is a need for blood of people that are of African descent. Seems like a simple call. The truth is, it's not such a simple call because of the barriers and systemic challenges have been embedded into the blood system. And I hope I have also shown you that this issue of conflating social and biology is not just within the blood system. The blood system is one example of where this happens, but it also happens in other diagnostic tools and other parts of our health system. So today we are going to be having a roundtable discussion on the blood system and the ways in which the systemic racism is embedded in it. So on that note, I am going to turn it over to Saya.
Thank you so much for that information. You covered a lot of the topics that I planned to talk about, so that makes my task a little bit easier. I just want to thank everyone today for being here today and participating in this webinar. It's really my pleasure. When Dr. Dzifa reached out to me, she's reached out to me many a times. about this topic, I felt that I couldn't say no, as it's a passion project of mine, and also it's a very pertinent and important subject. So with that, let me just start here. So a little bit about myself. I was asked to introduce myself. So my name is, well, it says Sarah Mwamba on there, but my name is Sarah Nsea Mwamba. I go by Nsea Mwamba. I'm a sociologist by training. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, and then a master's degree, a bilingual master's degree in sociology as well too, from the University of Ottawa. And my subspecialization was in interethnic relation. Kind of a fun fact, health is not my space at all. I actually work professionally in policy, but more so in criminal justice. I actually went to grad school to study criminal justice. And once I got there, I just really was not finding a topic that I felt resonated, that would contribute to the literature. But I always had this notion of the blood system. I was always aware that there was something amiss in the blood system that really wasn't being talked about, with the exception of Dr. Dryden, who's on the call as well too. So I've actually been following your work for some time, so it's a pleasure to share this space with you today. So with that, a little bit about myself, how I came to kind of study the blood system. But before I jump into that, I just want to put a fun fact out there that I'm actually really scared of blood. Reading it, thinking about it, talking about it was really torture for me as we talk about some of the barriers to studying this topic specifically. That was definitely a barrier for me. So I thought I would put that out there. I'm sure I would have been in the health sciences otherwise, but I think that fear kept me in sociology. So as you know, my thesis, which I wrote between 2016 and 2018, on and off part-time, is titled Separate But Equal, the Black Racial Classification in the Canadian Blood System. Where did I come up with that title? Separate But Equal, you may be familiar with the civil rights movement slogan that was used during the Jim Crow era, where Blacks were said in the US to have equal rights and to be equal members of society, but were treated separately. So as I read through the blood policies and as we go through some of my findings, I really felt that that notion of separate but equal really resonated for this topic. I just want to start off my presentation with just a few quotes, just as priming quotes, I guess I would say, just to kind of get our minds going. These were some of the quotes that I was reading as I was going through my research and as I was reading, and none of it really made sense, but this is the way that they were presented to me. So the very first quote is, people who have lived in certain regions of Africa who may have been exposed to a new strain of the virus that causes AIDS, HIV-1 group O, are not eligible to donate blood. This is not based on race or ethnicity, but possible exposure to HIV-1 group O. So this was a deferral that was in place in 2015 from the Canadian Blood Services, as well as Héma-Québec, the blood service operator in the province of Quebec. The second quote is, several Black women who would like to give blood are prevented from doing so because of their hemoglobin 1 count. Because their hemoglobin 1 count is naturally lower than Héma-Québec's eligibility criterion. And integrating these new donors would help us to better meet the blood requirements of those in need within the Black community. Again, that was from Héma-Québec, and it's under the heading of Black Women in Blood Donation. That was in 2016, but you can definitely go to the website now and see that heading is still there. Certain blood types are unique to specific racial and ethnic groups. Therefore, it is essential that the donor diversity match the patient diversity. That was the American Red Cross under their heading of Blood and Diversity, Rare Blood Types. That was in 2016. The next one says, immigrants from some countries are disallowed from giving blood. Africans are barred from donating blood due to HIV concerns. This was an article in a news article heading from Tristan Topper, and it was titled Canadian Blood Services Calls for More Blood from Visible Minorities. Notice that the HIV concern related directly to African populations. Also noting that we all know that Africa is a continent and a vast continent at that. So just looking at the interplays, pointing out those interplays there. The next quote is, blood donation, the contribution of the Black communities has increased significantly, but the need is still great. Héma-Québec is making an effort to reach out to more donors in the Black communities. A human donation can save the life of another human being, regardless of skin color or ethnic origin. Chances of finding compatible donors are better in the case of donors of the same racial origin. That's from Héma-Québec again in 2016. Haitians should be and are allowed to donate blood in Canada, provided they meet the existing selection criterion required of all blood donors. However, because of uncertainties currently surrounding the issue, recent immigrants from Haiti are being advised not to become blood donors at this time. This was a news release from the Canadian Red Cross in February of 1983. The blue tag will identify the donated blood as having come from an African American and a Black donor, and it will be tested for special characteristics. Just pointing out the term special characteristics when speaking about Black, African Americans, that is definitely a reoccurring theme that we will see throughout the blood systems language. More Black donors needed, Héma-Québec urges in the special drive. This was from a CBC article in 2017, and people in need of blood are more likely to find compatible blood donors among their own racial group. This was again from a news article this one in 2012. Why do I read these quotes first? In the beginning of my research, I laid out these quotes as the opening, specifically because they span decades, with the oldest one being from 1983 all the way to 2017, I believe is the latest quote. But the themes are reoccurring. It's specific to the Black population, specific to Black population, specific to blood and blood donation, and the special characteristics, quote unquote, that Black populations have. So as we go through the presentation and the webinar, I just encourage you to recall some of these quotes and these themes. And perhaps you have instances, or you've seen some of these headings, or you're familiar with them and can connect them to your own personal stories. So largely speaking, how did I come to study Black populations and the Canadian blood system? It's kind of a windy story. I've been studying blood donation on and off in my own free time for probably the last 15 years, maybe a little bit more. And I've come up with 3 separate themes, reoccurring themes that I realized really inform my interest in the blood system. The first theme I call Oh Brother, the struggles of an international student. The second theme is undergrad, the African Caribbean Club. And the third theme is death of an elder, good enough in death, but not in life. So the first theme, Oh Brother, relates to my brother. When I was in high school, he went off to college, he went off to university, was an international student in the States. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the struggles of international students, but precarious work, restrictions on work visas seem to be the norm, or at least they were then. So he had a hard time finding work. On one of our phone calls, he let me know that students on campus were going to donate plasma, and you could donate plasma every 10 days, and you would be paid somewhere around 130 USD. Being a small college town, this was more than enough money for him to survive at the time. So him and his roommate, who happened to be a Caucasian, his Caucasian best friend, who he had grown up with here in Alberta, they went and presented to the clinic. Once they got to the clinic, my brother was denied his blood donation or plasma donation on the premise that he was born in Africa. So my brother was born in Congo, and my family had immigrated to Canada when he was about 2.5, 3 years old. So he called and he was just kind of telling me, oh, well, this job thing is not going to work out for me. Don't really understand it. They just told me I'm African, so I can't donate blood. So that was kind of my first instance of this just didn't really make sense. But we were kind of like typical. Black people being excluded from some kind of American institution was our thoughts. Fast forward some years later, I'm in university in my undergrad. I am the secretary of the African Caribbean Club there. And we are trying to find ways to be civically engaged on campus. There wasn't a very big population of us, and we kind of wanted to make an impact. We were brainstorming. There was about 30 of us in this space, and we were thinking like bake sales. There was restriction on bringing external food. Fashion shows had been done, concerts, etc. Somebody piped up and said, "How about a blood drive? Why don't we host a blood drive?" And I can't recall who, but somebody mentioned immediately, like, I don't think we can donate blood in Canada, or that any of us here are eligible to donate blood. So we quickly went on the website, and sure enough, the African indefinite deferral that was mentioned in the earlier quote was in place. This is about 12, 13 years ago, not to age myself. And we kind of went around the classroom and thought, how many people can donate blood? Out of that group of about 30, if I remember correctly, there was one person who would be eligible to donate blood. And we'll talk about those eligibilities a little bit more as we go forward. So that was the second kind of confirming theme that something was really, really strange about the blood donation system in Canada. The third theme, death of an elder, good enough in death, but not in life, was a friend of my dad's, an elder in the Congolese community, was sick and was in the hospital, and unfortunately was attached to machines, and was told, the family and the community was told that he wasn't going to make it. So as we do in our culture, the Matanga culture, we come and we pay our respects, whether you know the person or not. So as folks were coming to the hospital, paying their respects, seeing him on the ventilators, my parents were in the room as close friends, and the doctor came in and asked and explained that he was no longer here, his brain function was no longer working, but they wanted to talk about the possibility of organ donation, and they were keeping him essentially alive in that way, and wanted to know if the family was interested in that. Later that evening, I had a conversation with my parents, and they were not sure about what the decision was going to be of this family. But I thought to myself, knowing what I kind of knew on a preliminary basis, that this person in life was unable to donate blood. Had this been 2 weeks ago, he would not be able to donate blood. But now today, in death, he's able to donate potentially his organs to science or to another individual. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, it kind of started to percolate some questions in my mind that maybe these policies that I had read were not all the way, I guess, legit or scientific, as they would say. So that's kind of how I came to study blood donation. When I got to grad school, like I said, I looked for a topic. I couldn't find a topic, but I had already had that interest, and I decided to dig a little bit deeper on this topic in of itself. So how did I do it? So when I initially started, I was interested to talk to Black peoples and to ask them how they felt about their inability to donate blood, more or less. I quickly found out through my preliminary research that the majority of the Black people that I spoke to or that were referred to me didn't really know anything about the policies in place. I would ask questions, but the questions I was asking were essentially loaded. I was telling them, and I was waiting for a response that they really had no knowledge of. So that got me thinking, and I realized that the approach of studying, doing a qualitative research, I should say, and interviewing folks about their experience in the blood drive might not be the way to go. So I went back to the drawing board and decided to look at all the publicly available data that was there. What I realized is the blood system had a lot of information. The blood operators, there were a lot of organizations, and I decided that I should try to understand the space of Black peoples within the Canadian blood system. So that's how I came to study. That's how I came to study the blood system specifically through publicly available data. What did that publicly available data look like? It looked like donor pamphlets. It looked like various blood-related organizations like HEMA Quebec, Canadian Blood Services, the Hemophilia Society, the FDA, really anything and anyone who talked about Black people and blood donation in any facet, I was interested in reading. Further to that, I was reading the academic literature. There really wasn't much information there, but as mentioned, Dr. Dryden was writing on the topic. And there were also a few other studies that had taken place in Quebec that mapped the experiences of Black people. So that gave me a good starting point. With that, I used a critical discourse analysis. So the critical discourse analysis approach was, I didn't approach the documents really from a neutral perspective. I approached it from a perspective that I knew something was off, and I was trying to understand the discourse behind what was the intention of what they were saying, and whether not only their intention, but what were they saying in practice versus what they were saying in theory. So that was my approach. And in that critical discourse analysis, I also moved towards a discourse historical approach. So I really wanted to understand, not only in a vacuum, I was no longer just interested in the experiences of the African indefinite deferral. I wanted to understand the whole scope from beginning to end. So that brings me to my next slide. My research question, broadly speaking, was, does institutionalized negrophobia exist in the regulatory policies and procedures of the Canadian blood donation system? That was my initial question. My sub-question was, what is the role of race and the assumption about racial identity within the blood system? And my third question was, how does the Black racial classification and the assumptions about its racial identity factor into the blood system as it pertains to the movement of blood between bodies in its collection and in its storage? That's kind of a mouthful, but the main question for me is there institutionalized negrophobia in the regulatory policies? I use that term negrophobia specifically, and I should explain, is at the time that I was writing this research, it was pre-George Floyd movement, the anti-racism movement, and many people just didn't understand what I was researching. When I went to my committee and I presented that I was interested in studying anti-Blackness, it was like the most charged word that I could have used in front of my panel. They cautioned me not to look for racism because blood was blood. They cautioned me that anti-Blackness is a very almost derogatory term and a scary term that wouldn't be well understood. I wasn't comfortable with removing the word altogether, so I used the word throughout my thesis, but I settled on the word negrophobia because much of the literature on blood donation was looking at homophobia within the blood system. So from there, I was able to pull from that language to integrate it within the Black experience. The most interesting part of the research is really the results, but in order to really understand the results and understand the scope of the experiences of Black peoples within the blood system, it's really important to understand some key concepts. So among those concepts are the Canadian blood system, are the experiences of Black people within the blood donation system, and as well the migration trends of Black peoples in Canada. So in terms of the Canadian blood system, so the blood system as we know it today, the voluntary non-enumerated anonymous patient recipient blood collection system, sorry, that's a mouthful, was erected in response to World War II. So it was initially founded in 1896 as a humanitarian organization for domestic disaster and relief in war-zone healthcare. At the time, it was a Canadian Red Cross Society, and it introduced its first transfusion program in 1940. So in 1947, the first peacetime donor clinics were established, dispersing services beyond the armed forces to also include civilians. So as a result, the Canadian Red Cross was able to supply blood from both nationally and internationally for treatment of blood components. So it's important to understand that the blood system is a blood economy. It doesn't stand alone. In Canada, our blood doesn't just stay within Canada. Our blood, our plasma is exchanged within the US, within Australia, within really Canada's natural partners. So while the blood system appeared to be secure, what ensued in the 70s proved to be lethal to the integrity of the blood system and its recipients. I'm moving through this a bit quickly and happy to answer questions after the presentation, but this is just to build an understanding generally of the blood system in Canada. So in the 70s, this is when the blood tainting scandal occurred. So in 1970, in the late 70s and 80s marked a period of tragedy when the most enormous public health catastrophe in Canadian history took place. I think we could argue that COVID may have surpassed that, but nonetheless, at the time that I was doing my research, this was the largest catastrophe in terms of health that took place in Canada. The medical technologies were not equipped to detect the unknown virus, and an estimated 1,100 Canadians were infected with HIV and the virus that causes AIDS, and a number of other viruses. This event has come to be referred as the blood tainting scandal. This eventually resulted in the federal government's establishment of the Criver Commission. So the Criver Commission reviewed all Canadian blood system to determine the fundamentals of the contamination scandal. The substantial report singled out the ineffective and half-hearted risk reduction strategies on behalf of the Canadian Red Cross. It was presented before the House of Commons in 1997. The inquiry issued a series of recommendations for overhauling the collection, processing, and management of blood products. Criver found that by authorizing donations from populations presumed to pose contamination risk to the Canadian blood supply, the Red Cross had failed to soundly respond to the HIV crisis with sufficient competency. The Commission asserted that the primacy of safety, declaring that safety ought to transcend all other principles and policy. Thus, the use of precautionary policy principles as the first lines of defense against the possible threats of blood supply came as a critical recommendation in the report. So now we had two new blood operators, which is Canadian Blood Services and Héma-Québec. This is who we know today. In consequence to that, to the report, the Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, stripped the Canadian Red Cross of its authority to oversee the blood operation, and Héma-Québec was created, which operates in Quebec, and Canadian Blood Services performs the equivalencies in the remaining provinces and territories. So the new blood operators implemented stringent deferral and regulatory regimes, ironically creating new barriers for some populations. I say some populations because, as we'll see in the results, the Black populations were already impacted and were already receiving differential treatment within the blood system. So for Black populations, the consequences of the tainting scandal did not just create new barriers, but it continued a legacy of differential treatment unique to Black populations. Blood donation and Black populations. So from a broad perspective, the US, the international literature suggests that of all Black diasporic communities, African Americans have gained the most academic prominence. The literature is notable. It cites donor recruitment issues, iatrophobia, the fear and aversion of the medical system, and scientific racism. And it also speaks to the American Red Cross's initial Negro segregation. Another interesting point is that the American literature cites the ironies of Dr. Charles Drew. He was the African director of the American Red Cross at the time, who was responsible for developing the blood bank, but he himself was denied access to it based on his race. In Australia, we've had some researchers from Polanski, Specifically, he has studied sub-Saharan African populations of blood donations. And there, the informants, African migrants to Australia, have reported sentiments of fears of discrimination and or racism at blood donation banks. And they've also expressed that they believe that their blood would be disqualified from donation based on race specifically, and also on fear of contagion and disease because they were from Africa. In Israel, in the mid 90s, there was a deceptive process that was taking place where blood was collected from African donors for a period of nearly 5 years and was, unbeknownst to the donors, was routinely discarded before it reached the banking system. The basis of the policy was said to be premised on the fear and disease contamination, which led to widespread protests by Ethiopian Jews who denounced the policy as racist. Headlines read, "Black Israelis riot over insult to their blood." So this kind of weird, unfortunate and racist policies in blood donations do happen. It's not so far-fetched to assume that beyond differential treatment, there would also be racism, blatant racism. Further to that, it was later reported that African migrants were the only ethnic groups required to be blood tested upon arrival to Israel. Bringing it to Canada, the bulk of the Canadian literature, maybe 10 studies since 2010, were published by Joanne Charbonneau and Natalie Tran in collaboration with HEMA Quebec. Their projects surrounded specifically the Haitian community and sometimes the ACB community, the African Caribbean and Black populations. In Quebec, studying the intergenerational iaitrophobia, the refusal to donate blood in the province. So what was interesting about some of these studies that I was finding is there was a constant conversation about why Black people don't want to donate blood, but there were no conversations about the barriers to blood donation for Black people. Most recently, as mentioned in the introduction, Dr. Dryden has taken a more critical approach to the study of Black populations, which is great, by examining the ACB MSM, men who have sex with men, in the Canadian Blood Services Donor History Questionnaire, as well as a wide body of literature that has really moved forward the topic of critically analyzing from a race perspective the blood system in Canada. So I'll just generalize this because I think there is a common understanding, but in order to understand the blood donation system, Black populations and how they work together, it's important to understand Blacks in Canada and Blackness. We know that we are a homogenous community. We know that we come from different backgrounds. Dr. Zifa talked about it in the beginning, and that there is no one individual that we can say is one and the same in terms of the ethnicity and Blackness. So the terminologies of Black and Blackness are tremendously ambiguous, and they amalgamate a variety of distinctive ethnicity into a single word. For the sake of this, of my thesis, I encompass Blacks, Afro-descendants, the Black diaspora, African Blacks, African American Blacks, Canadian Blacks, really anybody who identifies within this realm. I use that as my definition for Blackness. In saying that, Blackness is at once racial as it is ethnic. This means to say that by virtue of racial identification, by physical demarcation, a shared historical legacy of slavery, resistance, as well as impact on racism, distinct from others affecting immigration, education, employment, health in this case, the justice system, mass media, and culture, the conceivably isolated experience of a single Black subgroup necessarily impacts the total Black population. What does that mean? I often get referred to as African American. I'm sure many of you do as well too. I often get referred to with Black tropes that really don't relate to my ethnicity at all. So what that means to say is, yes, we are of many different heterogeneous groups as Black peoples, but we are all put under a single umbrella, specifically within the Western world. So I think it's important to talk about the intricacies, but also to understand how we are homogenized as a group, to understand our role within the blood system. Black history in Canada. So to understand the trends, it's important to appreciate the extensive history. Black slavery existed in Canada for nearly 200 years, from 1628 until 1834. During that time, Blacks fleeing from slavery persecution in the United States found themselves re-enslaved or living discounted versions of freedom here in Canada. Thus, the first Blacks in Canada were a combination of migrants from slaves, descendants of slaves, escaped slaves by the Underground Railway, ex-slaves freed by the British during the Revolution of 1812, and loyalists. So on arrival, they found settlements in Nova Scotia and Ontario, and later in the Western provinces with the opening of the frontier in the mid-1800s. From the abolishment of slavery until the late 60s, racial segregation was the ruling regime in Canada. This was a de facto policy, which meant that Black peoples were segregated in housing, in schooling, employment, health, and the general exclusion from public spaces. Stats Canada says that in 1901, in the 1901 census of the population found that 17,400 persons, so about 0.3% of the top of the population, was classified as Black in 1901. So in the ensuing decades, that increased more, that actually decreased. The number increased in 1961, but the percentage decreased to 0.2. So the sentiments were that Black immigration should be stopped and that Blacks already in Canada should strictly be segregated or deported. So it's important to understand this because as we talk about the Negro segregation that took place in the US, sometimes Canadians or in Canada, we like to absolve ourselves of that history. I know that over the last few years, that history has really come to the forefront and then it's been received socially and people have now accepted that racism does exist. But it's just really important to anchor that Canada is not absolved from the racist and segregatory legacy that the United States also had. So the federal government favored favored a covert ban of Black immigration. And it wasn't until the 1967 Immigration Act that really the complexion of Canada started to darken. So with that, between the 60s and the 80s, the Caribbean nations took the lead with Jamaica and Haiti as the most significant source countries of Black migrants. So the Jamaican presence in Canada was a direct result of post-World War demand of domestic labor. As white women entered the workforce, the demand for domestic caregivers increased. In the Western Domestic Scheme, the Canadian government aggressively recruited a large number of young Black Caribbean women to fill the employment gap. In respect to Haiti, the island nation became a leading source country following the three significant events: the father and son Duvalier regime in 1957 and 1971, and the takeoff of the Canadian, notably Quebec, economy. So the first wave in the 60s included mostly professionals. This is the wave of the Haitian community, while the second wave met a blue-collar demand, and the third wave of the Haitian migration came in the 80s and comprised of family reunification and refugees. So a lot of the folks that were already here were obviously sending for their families, or their families wanted to rejoin them here as well too. So really important to understand these migration waves, to understand the trends that took place in the blood system. In the 90s, the statistics demonstrate a drastic shift of ethnicity, of Black ethnicity in Canada. The entrance, the 2001 census report states that 48% of Black immigrants who arrived in the 90s were directly from the African continent, virtually the same population as Caribbean, 47% at the time. In retrospect, this proves to be an exponential increase from 1961, when a meager 1% immigrants derived from the continent, from Africa. So the exponential increase in African source countries is consistent with the shift of what was going on in African socio-political climates in the past 60 to 70 years. The continent has rapidly shifted from colonial rule, independence to rampant, unfortunate civil wars. At the moment, continental Africans are reported to be the third largest group of entrants to Canada, with an estimated 145,700 newcomers each year. Note that these statistics are dated because they were the stats that were taken at the time of my that I was writing my research, but they have undoubtedly increased. Today, the total Black diaspora is the third largest racialized group in Canada, making up 15.6% of the racialized population and makes up the largest racialized group in the province of Quebec. According to the results from the 2016 census, Black populations in Canada now have surpassed the million mark, 1.2 million, and I'm sure we're way past that now. Blacks in Canada are originally from a multitude of countries, bringing together diverse ethnicities, immigration histories, and relationship to Canada. So now we have people who are coming as refugees, we have international students, we have temporary workers, we have family reunification. The waves have really diversified. While some can trace their ancestry back several centuries, most have immigrated in recent decades and are just beginning to plant roots. So given the significant diversity, it's unfeasible to consider Black Canadians homogeneous populations, but the differences and similarities shared by the communities play an integral role in understanding the relationship between race, ethnicity, as well as their health, particularly as it relates to the blood system in this case. So the Black body politic, health and its body politic, I'm not going to delve into this too much, but just to provide an overview, the Canadian literature on Black health is scarce. At the time that I was conducting my research, it was described as equivocal with few exceptions. So it was really hard to find studies that spoke specifically to the experiences of Black populations within Canada. A lot of the research data relied upon the American statistics and American studies. Having just explained the migration trends of Canadians, Black Canadians, as opposed to Americans, it's really not something that can be comparable. But unfortunately, within that amalgamation that we see that is often done in the West and also elsewhere, we were in Canada left to the devices of American study. So in terms of, sorry about that. In terms of, note that across the West, comprehensive results of Black health. So in terms of health, is across the West, so including mostly the US data, Blacks have a higher all-causing mortality rates and life expectancy, worse mental health than whites and other racial groups. This speaks to what Dr. Difa was speaking to in the introduction, but instead, from a sociological approach and a social science perspective, the social determinants of health tell us way more about the experiences of Black people than the leading perspectives on Black health from a medical standpoint. The social determinants speak specifically to complex social interactions among unhealthy environments, social pressures, and limitation lifestyle factors, and limited access to healthcare. This is super important because the way that these institutions really put out this information as fact can really make you even believe as a Black person. Personally, I'm not in the health field, but you can really start believing that things are wrong with you. And that is the role of institutional racism. That is the legacy that we were given. So it's extremely important to combat these narratives. Thus, it is important to denote that Black people are not dying of exotic, incurable, poorly understood illnesses, nor of genetic diseases that target only them. Rather, the literature on health equity has demonstrated that it is foremost a differential treatment in health systems that creates inequities for the common ailments that are more often prevented and treated among whites than among Blacks. I think that sums it all up. Blood, the definition of blood. This has always kind of been an interesting point when I've presented this topic to folks in the medical and the health field, but I think we've come into a space where there's more acceptance than there was historically. So the definitions of blood. So I really like this quote by Keith Wei Liu, who writes on sickle cell and the history of the myths and really the lies that were put in place. And he writes about that in the United States. So according to blood operators, blood is a liquid tissue made up of key components, approximately 40 to 45% blood cells, 55% plasma, and 1% platelets and white blood cells pumped through the body by the heart through blood vessels. So this is the more or less the scientific version. It's not cited there, but I got that from the Canadian Blood Services website. As a delivery system of oxygen, minerals, hormones, nutrition, among other critical materials to the organs, blood also aids in clearing the body of waste. By way of this definition, blood is admittedly a biological substance with well-calculated physical proponents. I am not arguing the validity of the physical and biological properties of blood. However, from a symbolic perspective, from a social science or a sociological perspective, the way in which we invoke blood on a day-to-day basis, the way in which we experience blood is not through the scientized definition. Perhaps for those who work in a hospital setting, who see blood reoccurringly on a daily basis, but the majority of society on a day-to-day basis does not experience blood. The way that we experience blood is in a symbolic sense. We can look at it from a religious perspective. We can look at it from, I often say, this is my blood brother versus this is my brother. From a symbolic point, we've seen how blood has been used in racial perspective. Here in Canada, Indigenous blood quantum laws, the way that we invoke blood is symbolically. So the idea that the definition of blood provided to us by blood operators is only a physical and biological proponent, and that the symbolic notions that we are surrounded by on a day-to-day basis does not permeate into the blood system is virtually impossible. The physical science, yes, want to work and move towards objectivity, but we know that social consciousness, social thought, our environment often dictates the way in which we approach those physical proponents. So according to symbolic scholars of blood, such a definition is precisely the object of modern sciences. It categorically disenchants the fluid, eliminating all of its mystical nature and its symbolic changes, that it may be considered exclusively for its biological and quantifiable features. The symbolic power of blood is vast. A number of disciplines have taken interest in it, notably history, the arts, religious studies, anthropology, as well as sociology. In other words, the literature coheres on an understanding that blood is a malleable space-time contingent property, which is at once a social fluid and a cultural entity, fundamentally reflexive of the complex social meanings placed on the body in direct association to the structures and strains of social relationship. Lest we forget, Blacks and scientific racism. This quote, which is a bit crude, not a bit, very crude, states that it was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals. We often forget that not so long ago that Black people were not considered human beings. So it's not so far-fetched to associate racialized science to scientific racism. I would argue that racialized science is the gateway to scientific racism. By focusing on race, we open opportunities to create differential approaches that are racist in nature. So in considering the implication of racial science, particularly as it relates to differential treatment in blood donation, it is prudent to keep in mind the lessons learned from the history of scientific racism. In the West, Black populations have been exploited in involuntary experiments at a higher rate than any other ethnic groups. Therefore, I urge that in considering the theoretical racial and blood implications of this study, keep the noted examples in mind at the forefront of your attention and recall that history is discursively recurrent. There's really nothing new under the sun. So moving to the results section, and I think this is probably the most interesting part of the research, that's what I would say. The beginning just provided some tools to be able to guide you through the results section, but I'm happy to provide clarifications afterwards to any points that may not be clear, because I know that I kind of ran through those pretty quickly. So essentially what I did is I realized that I needed to map the experience of Blackness within the Canadian blood system. Once I started mapping those experiences, I came up with 4 themes: the bad blood, Black blood, so the Negro segregation, voluntary exclusion, the Haitian ban, the sub-Saharan African deferral, phenotype blood, rare blood, Black women, and blood donations. So these were the 4 themes that I was able to locate throughout the literature. So bad blood, Black blood, the Negro blood segregation. I'm just going to read this poem. It's the cross of red that burns so bright in fire, store, and flood is now the crooked Nazi sign that spurns a Negro blood. So this was posted in 1942 in the Cleveland Call and Post, and it was in revolt to the segregation laws for blood policy in the United States. So according to the literature, the first Canadian blood transfusions were reserved for white Americans and British soldiers. Therefore, all collected blood in Canada was racially cataloged with the purpose of ensuring that white soldiers did not receive inferior blood, said to be inherent to Black peoples. The racial tagging of blood in Canada was a combination of nationalistic anti-Black sentiments partnered with the American Red Cross racial directives as per Jim Crow, whereby fears of miscegenation, mongrelization, and Black pathologies, namely syphilis, at the time were the rationale for said exclusion. Consequently, blood narratives of racism, racial segregation, and miscegenations framed the first policies of blood donation in Canada. The literature suggests that it was not until the mid-60s convulsion of the American Civil Rights Movement that the practice of racial tagging of Black blood was reluctantly eliminated across Canada and United States. So to provide context, I searched within the Canadian archives to find information that this did actually take place in Canada. And there was almost no documented information. The only 2 authors that spoke to it in Canada was Dr. Dryden and Vickers, who wrote a book on the politics of Canada, Australia, and the United States, comparing them. And there was a small, just 1 line stating that this took place in Canada. So in Canada, the topic of the Negro segregation, like I said, is invisible, and it has not been given any level of prominence throughout the Canadian data sets, and the omission of this Black blood story is overt. There are no publicly accessible sources of information from the current blood operators or from the Canadian Red Cross or Health Canada to officially confirm if this policy in fact took place. An extensive review of the Canadian Red Cross historical highlights, which documented the 120 years of the Red Cross, cataloging artifacts, events, and etc., did not cover or mention the Negro segregation policy at all. In contrast, in respect to representation of minority population, prominence was given to the role of white women in blood donation and war efforts. So they have everything from pins, posters. Really, when it came to talking about if this took place in Canada, there was no information whatsoever. In my next slide, I have just a few pictures. This is in the United States. Something that I appreciated throughout my research with the US is that there was a certain level of transparency. There was some documentation. So this says Red Cross says refusal of Negro blood in the US is in order. The next picture says Red Cross bans Negro blood. And these are all American sources. And this one it's all the same to him. And the science too. Science has proven in a microscopic test that white and Negro blood is identical. So they speak to the resistance that from the onset, there was discussions about these policies. There was pushback, the US, the American Red Cross has documented it, and there's been other articles written about it, but in Canada, that information has not been readily available. The second theme was the voluntary exclusion, the Haitian blood ban. So in the 80s, when the first cases of HIV/AIDS were initially identifies, researchers implicated 4 major high-risk groups for the spread of this new blood-borne disease. Those groups were homosexuals, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. It's horrible, I know. Collectively referred with the moniker the 4 H's. The Haitian risk assessment, which is of relevance to the Black populations, which is exactly the topic we're talking about, was the sole ethnic and consequently racial exclusion. It differed from the other 3 behavioral-based exclusions, and this was specifically by race and ethnicity. So in March of 1983, the United States Public Health Service advised that all agencies collecting blood in the United States, that anyone considered at risk of developing AIDS, meaning the 4 H's, should be categorically excluded from donation. So 1 week later, so this was in the United States, they were categorical about the exclusion. A week later, in the first of 3 press releases, the Canadian Red Cross asked donors belonging to those populations to refrain from voluntarily donating blood. The Canadian approach to donor exclusion was much more passive than that of the United States. So the first press release, I'm not going to read the whole blurb, but I'll read the key points. The Canadian Red Cross Society advised members of our groups identified as high risk of carrying AIDS not to give blood. These groups are patients diagnosed with AIDS, sexual partners of AIDS, patients of AIDS patients, persons with AIDS symptoms, sexually active homosexuals, bisexual men with multiple partners, and recent immigrants, current and past drug users, and sexual partners of individuals at risk. Did you have a question for me, Zifa? Dr. Zifa?
Yeah,
I just saw your
yes.
camera on.
Yes, no, I was just prompting you. I think we're getting into our Q&A section here.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
Thank you. So I'll move through these pretty quickly so we can see all of the themes. So right after the press release, obviously the Haitian community was besides themselves. There were huge marches and demonstrations that took place in the US as well as here in Canada. So with that, we see here in this imagery that we have somebody saying proud of our blood. And the next imagery, we have AIDS is behavioral and not racial. So the second press release, I'll just summarize it very quickly, said that the Canadian Red Cross was feeling especially sensitive to the accusations that they were racist. And they went on to reiterate that high-risk groups like the Haitian community should just voluntarily refrain from donating blood. So this is where it says Haitians should and are allowed to donate blood in Canada, provided they meet the existing selection criterion of all blood donors. However, because of the uncertainties currently surrounding this issue, recent immigrants from Haiti are being advised not to become blood donors at this time. Here we have a nurse who's obviously a Black woman at the time. She was a nurse during this time. The slide is in French, I recognize that. I just wanted to keep the integrity of her comment. And she speaks of the stigmatization that she faced during that time, that people didn't want to sit with her, people in the hospital didn't want to approach her as a Haitian woman. They said that this was her disease. And this, she says, to this day, she does not forgive the blood bank for passing this type of messaging. After the second press release, the Canadian Red Cross attempted to continue and to fix issues with the Haitian community, but it was irreparable at that time. And to this day, there is a legacy that has been passed on to Black populations by virtue of the experience of Haitian people based on this exclusion. In terms of the sub-Saharan African deferrals, and I can talk about it more within the panel, or Dr. Dryden can comment on it as well too. This policy specifically stated that people who have lived in certain regions of Africa who may have been exposed to the new strain of the virus that causes AIDS are not eligible to donate blood. People who have received blood transfusion while visiting Africa, people who had sex with people who have lived there, and people are not permitted to donate blood. Those countries included Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Niger, and Nigeria. So that was the next deferral that was in place. I'm just going to move through some of the slides a bit quickly so we can sorry. So the fourth point was rare blood, black blood. This speaks to the calls from the blood operators to looking for phenotypic blood. If you look through Canadian Blood Services, if you look through Héma-Québec, there's a section that says Black blood donation, and that specifically requests that Black peoples donate blood to help other Black people. So that speaks to the notion that we have special characteristics only in our blood that can help only other Black people. And we know how problematic special characteristics can be, especially when you're talking about Black populations and the history of racism. And the last bit that I wanted to mention was Black blood, Black women and blood donation. So the last trend this is specific to Héma-Québec. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but Black women have apparently a lower hemoglobin, physiologically a lower hemoglobin level than Caucasian women. And as a result, 1/3 of those who register for blood drives are prohibited from giving blood. So therefore, Héma-Québec has created a specific category for Black women so that when they present to blood donor clinics, a lower hemoglobin will be accepted. The interesting thing about this is there's no definition on who is a Black woman. Are we talking mixed race? Are we talking from Africa? It's just Black women, I should say. And also the juxtaposition of comparing Black women as diseased and Caucasian women as the epitome is super problematic in of itself. So I've just kind of summed up the themes very quickly. And just so we can move to this discussion panel in the interest of time, I apologize I went over with some of the theory bits, but I'm happy to just delve into some other themes as well too, as needed.
Thank you so much, Saya, for that riveting overview of the policy and the histories they were living with, the history and the present day. I apologize, I didn't want to rush you because there's just so much information to get into, but I also wanted to open the floor for conversation and for dialogue so that attendees can also ask questions, and we might be able to cover some of the things that you had uncovered in your thesis. At this point, bringing Dr. Dryden to welcome her officially to the webinar, and maybe just give her a few minutes. She's well known, but give her a few minutes to introduce herself to us. And then we can dig into just uncovering some of these complexities. So Dr. Dryden, welcome. We're delighted to have you. If you don't mind introducing yourself to our attendees, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you. Hello. That was a very interesting presentation. It's always so humbling to see how one's own research, my own research, is informing the studies of students. And I'm looking forward to meeting with you, Sarah, afterwards, just to provide some gentle direction and some gentle corrections. I wanted to also include this article in the chat, which I wrote, which was published in 2022, that actually speaks about scientific racism and race biology and the reasons why we shouldn't use the words such as Caucasian that comes out of scientific racist practices and the way we understand scientific racism today. So I am the James R. Johnston Endowed Chair in Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University, the co-lead of the Black Health Education Collaborative, which is a national organization that's actually doing much of the work that you spoke about earlier when we started, Tasifa, the work about changing learning objectives, updating medical practice, working with students in medicine and nursing and public health So we've been working nationally around that work and collating and collecting and adding to the research around Black health in Canada. That's actually quite vibrant. I think there's much more than people realize. There's really some substantive work out there. I've also been researching Canadian Blood Services since about 1999, and Canadian Blood Services came into being in 1998. And so that was when I was working at York University, and York became the first university in Canada to ban blood donation clinics on campus because of the discriminatory donor policies. But I just wanted to offer some small corrections and some additional information that I think is important to understanding the way systemic anti-Black racism continues to operate within Canadian Blood Services. And I'll drop some links to important resources in the chat for people to see. But when we think about, the Canadian Red Cross Society, it's important to realize that Haitian people weren't the only identity that was being targeted, right? Homosexuals was an identity, it wasn't a behavior, it wasn't a practice. Hemophiliacs was an identity, it wasn't a behavior. The only behavior that was really mentioned or named is the use of heroin. And I think that's important because it speaks to the how systemic racism was manifesting at that time. If we look at how we understand sexual identities today, we need to know that it comes out of scientific racist practices. And so we see that when we see those targets, we also need to understand them as forms of systemic racism. But the other piece around donor exclusion, especially around that particular strain of HIV, that strain of HIV that they used to claim was just an African strain, was actually also had prevalence in the United States, Belgium, Germany, and France, I believe. I would need to look to confirm that in my work. And so remember, Canadian Blood Services came out of the tainted blood scandal. And so the fact that their purpose was to educate the Canadian population on behaviors that would support increasing safe blood. And instead of doing that, they relied on racist stigma around Black people, in this case, moving from Haiti to Africa, but made a choice about not focusing on predominantly white countries where that particular strain was also present. And so if you look at those questions around were you born in or lived in, or have you had sexual contact with, if you had sexual contact with anyone who was born in the United States and France and Belgium, or had blood products from anyone in the United States, Belgium, France, we see how ridiculous those questions are. But often the questions are when people believe that it's true that Africa, right, the very countrification of Africa, is where that strain exists. Then we see how white supremacy is working because people believe that that is a true thing. And then the one of the last pieces I'll mention as well, in terms of none of the donor questionnaire in Canadian Blood Services says this to this date is supposed to be based on science, but the science does not support those questions. When Dr. Charles Giroux was in Montreal, like, we really need to give him his props. He actually created the technology and the infrastructure to collect large quantities of blood to transport them great distances. And we don't speak about that enough. And I would also say that it is documented, that there is, the fact that I say in my dissertation, and I say in many other places, that Canadian Red Cross is following the American Red Cross for racially segregating the blood. I didn't just pull that out of my ass, right? Like, there is the documentation for that. It does exist. There are archives where we see that. Canadian Red Cross talks about it, or they did on their website, and some of the other early blood work, blood texts in Canada, like from Andre Picard and another person, and the Creever Commission. This is where footnotes are important. And I just wanted to say, it seems to me that your research committee were all white people. And if that's the case, then I'm really, really sorry. Often when graduate students are doing this work, they reach out to me. And so there's a MA thesis also from Quebec, where the graduate student saw me at a talk, where a graduate student reached out to me, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about their project so I could support and offer guidance for when your all white committee is like, oh, we shouldn't be talking about anti-Blackness or Afrophobia or Negrophobia or anti-Black racism or anti-Black homophobia or transphobia. And so at this stage of my career, I still have those conversations. But like I said, I'm happy to follow up with you to continue to offer support and gentle corrections. So happy to answer any other questions that you may have. And I'll put some of those resources in the chat since we don't have time to get into some of the detail now.
Thank you so much, Mosere. I think your work in this area has been definitely revolutionary in terms of moving our Canadian systems forward. And I apologize if you can hear that loud truck in the background there. But there are some questions that I thought, some of them I don't know that we would have a clear-cut answer for, but it really highlights the reason why we're doing this, which is that just like the Canadian, like we talked about the healthcare system, there are the practices of the Canadian blood system appears to conflate our social standings to be a biological predispositioning. So that is clear based on all the evidence that Saya has presented to us. And of course, Dr. Dryden's work has shown that clear. So there is this question is in the blood an organ? And how is it that this selective bias of not good enough to harvest our organ and tissue, but our blood is rejected? I asked doctors about this and not got an answer. Maybe I'll turn that over to you, Dr. Dryden. What do you have to say about that? And clearly, this is exactly why we're doing this work in raising awareness that, Saya, you said that, my blood was not good in life, but yeah, my organ is of benefit in death. Like, what is that all about? So Dr. Dryden, do you want to maybe address that question?
Yeah, I'm happy if other people have information around this as well. The use for organ donation in Black people became approved, if you will. I remember a friend of mine on Facebook writing about how they were a black gay man, how they were happy about being able to do this thing now in terms of share their organs, and they can hardly wait until they could donate blood. And I actually cite that in my thesis, which I defended in 2016, after having almost done this work for already over a decade at that point. So one of the things I want to add to what was already said, that yes, there used to be specific Black blood clinics because of the need for a Black recipient. And it's true, when that blood was collected, it wasn't then put back into the general donor population. It was kept or destroyed because it wasn't considered useful. There was worries about it. But understand, when we talk about this with Canadian Blood Services, they often will say that it was a geographic referral, not a deferral, not a racism deferral. It was about geography. But as all of you have said already, and all we know already, that geography often stands in for race. This is why we get asked, where are you really from? This is why these kinds of questions to African Nova Scotian folks, to historical Black communities in Ontario are also offended, because we end up being displaced. So there are people working, with CBS, and I always caution this, and people who are working on blood research in Black communities, and I caution this as well, because there is an accountability that is still needed from Canadian Blood Services, specifically about anti-Black racism. It's not enough to say, you know, we're going to do anti-racist work or an anti-racist donor system if there's not accountability specifically for anti-Black racism, not just systemic racism, but specifically around anti-Black racism. So yes, this is where you see racial discrimination happening when you have these moving parts. So this is okay, but that's not okay. This is useful, but that's not useful, especially when it comes to Black people. And, you know, we know about the atrocities that happened during the Second World War, not only against Jewish people, but against Black people, against gay people, against Romas, where we were often experimented on through and with blood practices and blood technologies. And you have to kind of dig into the archives to get that, because they don't like to speak about Black people being targeted during World War II, but they also don't like to speak about the ways in which our bodies were experimented on at that time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think there's other questions too around core blood donation and how there are these double standards around, you know, why can I donate my core blood without restriction or concerns, but they have put these restrictions on blood donation in general. And so PM and other people who have asked a question, you know, I have the same questions as well. There are deferrals that Nisea had also talked about, which is like the hemoglobin deferral. You will not be, it's not a secret that our blood, like the blood work that we have in our health system, those are not calibrated to different populations at all. Right? So for example, if you were to take white blood cell distribution of white blood cell and you kind of compare that against, you know, like geographic and ancestral background, you'll find that people of African descent do tend to have a lower white blood cell count than others, but that comes up as being abnormal. I can't tell you in my own practice how many times we will see a person of African descent come into the hospital, their white blood cells sitting in the 4 or something range, and they get worked up for everything under the sun, only for it to be shown that it is normal for this person, that it is fine, that there's nothing biologically wrong with this person. This is just where they live. The same can be said for the hemoglobin deferral for women, particularly women of African descent, where their levels are lower, right? So if you set a rate, if you set a cutoff at a level that I will never reach, I'm never going to be able to donate blood, right? So there is a call and a need for all of these things that we're using to make really life-changing decisions to be validated across population, particularly in Canada, where the diversity and the landscape is changing on a very rapid pace. So I think what I would offer is just saying that we are calling upon the blood system, the health system, Health Canada, and all of these organizations to really take a look at these processes that they have in place and how these processes are continuing to marginalize those of us in the Black bodies and also contributing to the disproportional mortality and morbidity rate that we're seeing. I know that we are very close, or we're actually out of time. And so I will invite folks to continue to engage with us in dialogue, whether through social media, through email. You certainly have access to Dr. Dryden's email, myself, but particularly to the organization. So if you do have questions, follow-up questions that you want to address, by all means, reach out to us, and we're more than happy to have the dialogue. We can't unpack all of these things in a 2-hour when it's been, 2 centuries plus harm that is being done. So we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. And if you want to support the work of our organization, by all means, we welcome donations. We welcome, just telling us what you've learned by attending these webinars. we want to pay a particular attention to our partner, the Sickle Cell Association of Canada. They are doing amazing work. So please support them in whatever way that you can. If you are able to donate blood, we ask you to go donate blood. If you are able to donate and you've gone and you're not able to for whatever reason, we want to hear that as well. They want to hear that, because this is the only way we're going to be able to push the buttons to be able to change policies. So I thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you, the panelists, for being here, and I really appreciate your time.